There is a ledger in the Kendrick County Archives listing 1,847 admissions to the county refuge farm between 1892 and 1951. The admissions include the elderly, the indigent, the mentally ill, the physically disabled, and those deemed unable to support themselves. The ledger documents who entered the facility when they arrived and their reason for admission. What it doesn't consistently document is who left, when they departed, or where they went. Of the 1,847 admissions recorded, only 412 have corresponding discharge records. I found the ledger while researching public welfare systems in the Meridian Republic during the late industrial period. Every county in Meridian operated some form of institutional care for residents who could not maintain independent living. These facilities went by various names: county farm, refuge farm, poorhouse, county home. But their function was consistent: to provide shelter and basic care for those without family support or financial means. The Kendrick County Refuge Farm was established in 1892 on a 200-acre property 5 miles outside the county seat. The facility was designed to house up to 80 residents who would work the farm in exchange for room and board. Those unable to work would still receive care. The system was meant to be self-sustaining. Residents would produce food and goods that would support the operation. The admission ledger shows steady intake from 1892 through 1951, when the facility closed. The entries are remarkably consistent: name, age, admission date, and reason. The reasons include no family support, unable to maintain employment, mental incapacity, physical disability, and elderly without means. The discharge records are far less consistent. For the first decade of operation, 1892 to 1902, discharge documentation appears relatively complete. Residents are noted as returned to family, transferred to state facility, deceased, or released to independent living. But after 1902, discharge records become sporadic. Between 1903 and 1951, only 253 of the 1,429 admissions during that period have discharge documentation. That is a documentation rate of less than 18%. More than 1,100 people were admitted to the Kendrick County Refuge Farm and have no official record of ever leaving. Here is what strikes me about the pattern. I examined the discharge records that do exist. The 412 documented discharges include 87 deaths, 143 transfers to state mental facilities or hospitals, 91 returns to family care, and 91 releases to independent living. These categories account for residents whose departures were formally processed through official channels. Deaths required certificates. Transfers required institutional paperwork. Family returns often involved county welfare offices. The 1,435 admissions with no discharge records are not categorized as any of these. They simply entered the facility and then disappear from the documentary record. I searched for death certificates. Meridian law required that all deaths be registered with the county clerk and that death certificates be issued. The certificates were compiled into county death registries maintained by the Department of Vital Records. I searched Kendrick County death registries from 1892 to 1951 for residents who died at the county refuge farm. I found 87 certificates, the same 87 documented in the discharge records. The death certificates list cause of death, attending physician if applicable, and burial location. All 87 follow standard documentation protocols. But if the refuge farm housed an average of 60 to 80 residents continuously for 59 years, statistical mortality rates would suggest hundreds of deaths should have occurred at the facility. The 87 documented deaths represent a fraction of expected mortality. Now here is where the timing becomes difficult to explain. I found county budget records showing operational expenditures for the refuge farm from 1892 to 1951. The budgets include line items for food, clothing, medical supplies, facility maintenance, and staff salaries. Starting in 1903, the budgets include a new recurring line item: resident services, undocumented. The expenditure appears annually from 1903 through 1951. The amounts vary but average approximately 800 marks per year. The budget documents provide no explanation of what resident services undocumented encompasses. The phrase undocumented appearing in an official budget line item is unusual. Budget allocations typically specify their purpose: food, medical care, transportation, burial. This allocation is defined by its lack of documentation. I searched County Commission meeting minutes for discussion of this budget item. I found one reference from a meeting in April 1903. A commission member questioned the resident services allocation and asked for clarification. The county administrator responded that the expenditure covered services required for residents whose departures are not processed through standard channels. The commission approved the budget without further discussion. The allocation continued for 48 years. But here is the detail that doesn't fit. I found a facility inspection report from 1912 conducted by the State Welfare Oversight Board. The inspection was part of routine monitoring of county care institutions. The report notes that the refuge farm was housing 73 residents at the time of inspection, and that facilities were adequate, though aging. The report includes no concerns about resident welfare or operational practices. The report does include one notation under administrative procedures. Discharge documentation protocols require standardization. Current record-keeping practices create gaps in resident tracking. The inspector identified that discharge records were incomplete. The recommendation was to standardize protocols. There is no evidence that standardization ever occurred. The discharge documentation gaps continued for another 39 years until the facility closed. I tried to find the facility's internal records. County institutions were required to maintain daily logs of resident activities, health incidents, and administrative actions. These logs were supposed to be preserved as part of the facility's operational archive. I found no internal records for the Kendrick County Refuge Farm in the county archives. No daily logs, no health incident reports, no administrative action records. The only surviving documentation is the admission ledger and the partial discharge records. When I asked the county archivist about the missing logs, she said they had likely been discarded when the facility closed in 1951. Standard practice at the time was to preserve summary documents like admission and discharge records but dispose of daily operational logs as they were considered too voluminous for long-term storage. But here is what bothers me most. I found cemetery records for the Kendrick County Public Burial Ground, a pauper cemetery established in 1890 for county residents who died without family or means for private burial. The cemetery was used primarily for refuge farm residents and other indigent deceased. The cemetery records show 214 burials between 1892 and 1951 identified as refuge farm residents. The burials include the 87 residents with death certificates, plus 127 additional burials with no corresponding death certificates in the county registry. The cemetery documentation notes name, burial date, and plot number. For the 127 burials without death certificates, the cause of death is listed as unrecorded, and the burial authorization is listed as county administrator. Emergency provisions. Emergency provisions in burial law allowed for immediate interment in cases where delays would create health hazards or when family notification was impossible. The provisions were intended for unusual circumstances. They were used 127 times for refuge farm residents over 59 years. I tried to trace individual residents through other records. I selected 50 names from the admission ledger with no discharge documentation. These were people admitted between 1910 and 1940, giving them time to potentially reappear in later census records, voter registrations, or other civil documentation if they had left the facility and resumed independent living. I found no subsequent records for any of the 50. They appear in the admission ledger and then nowhere else in county civil records. No census entries after admission, no voter registrations, no property records, no death certificates. They entered the refuge farm and left no further documentary trace in Kendrick County. I found one more document that I haven't been able to explain. It is a letter dated June 1927 from a woman named Clara Dennison to the County Commission. The letter inquires about her brother, Robert Dennison, who was admitted to the Refuge Farm in 1921 at age 34 for inability to maintain employment. Clara writes that she has not heard from Robert in 5 years and requests information about his current status and whereabouts. The county administrator's response, dated July 1927, states, Robert Dennison was a resident of the County Refuge Farm. His current status cannot be determined from available records. We recommend contacting the facility directly for resident information. The Refuge Farm was a county facility. The county administrator directed Clara to contact the facility for information that the county itself should have maintained. There is no indication that Clara received any further information. Robert Dennison's admission is in the ledger. He has no discharge record. He has no death certificate. He appears nowhere in civil records after 1921. The Kendrick County Refuge Farm operated for 59 years. It admitted 1847 residents. It documented the discharge or death of 412. The remaining 1435 have no official record of departure. Of those, at least 127 were buried in the pauper cemetery, with no death certificates. The county budgeted for undocumented resident services for 48 years. Facility inspection noted discharge documentation gaps and recommended standardization. The gaps continued until closure. The admission ledger is preserved. The discharge records are partial. The internal logs are gone, and 1435 people who entered the County Refuge Farm between 1892 and 1951 left no documented trace of ever leaving, living independently afterward, or dying in any officially recorded manner. The ledger still sits in the Kendrick County Archives, documenting who arrived and why, waiting for someone to document where they went.